In Seoul, money can buy silence. Power can buy immunity. But in my classroom? It can't buy a passing grade. Lindiwe doesn't flinch. She looks directly into the eyes of Joon-woo, the boy whose last name makes the principal's knees shake. "Pick it up, Joon-woo," she says, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel. The boy laughs. "My father owns this school. He owns this city. Do you know what happens to people who tell me no?" Lindiwe leans in, her shadow looming over him. "I know what happens to boys who never learn that word. They grow up to be small men. Take your seat. Now." The silence that follows is deafening. For the first time in his life, the untouchable boy obeys. But as he sits, he whispers a promise: "My father is coming tomorrow. And you're going to burn." The atmosphere at Seoul Royal Preparatory didn't just chill the next morning, it froze solid. Lindiwe arrived to find the usual swarm of colorful backpacks and chirping children replaced by a haunting, vacuum-like silence. Lining the curb were 6 identical black sedans, their engines idling with a low, predatory growl. Men in charcoal suits stood like statues at every entrance, their hands crossed over their waists, eyes hidden behind dark glass. The teacher's lounge was a morgue. "You should leave through the back," the principal whispered, his hands trembling so violently his tea splashed onto his desk. "Mr. Choi is in the foyer. He doesn't send lawyers, Ms. Cohn. He comes himself when he intends to finish things." "I have a lesson to teach," Lindiwe replied, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart against her ribs. She straightened her blazer, smoothed her hair, and walked toward the main hall. She saw him before he saw her. Choi Gun-woo stood in the center of the atrium, a pillar of lethal elegance. He was younger than she expected, with features carved from cold marble and eyes that seemed to absorb the light around him. Beside him, Joon-woo stood with his arms crossed, a triumphant, wicked smirk playing on his lips. "That's her," Joon-woo pointed, his voice ringing out in the hollow hall. "That's the one who put me in the corner." Gun-woo turned. The heir seemed to exit the room. He didn't shout, he didn't move. He simply watched her approach with a terrifying, focused stillness. As Lindiwe stopped 3 paces away, the bodyguards closed in behind her, cutting off the exit. "Ms. Cohn," Gun-woo said. His voice was a deep, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "My son tells me you laid hands on the future of the Choi family." "I laid a boundary, Mr. Choi," Lindiwe corrected, refusing to look at the shadows closing in. She met his gaze directly, an act of defiance that made the nearest bodyguard reach for his jacket. Gun-woo raised a single hand, halting his men. He stepped closer, leaning into her personal space until she could smell the scent of expensive tobacco and rain. "People have disappeared for less than a boundary." "Then you are raising a ghost, not a leader," she countered, her voice dropping to a fierce, low simmer. "If he is the future of your family, why are you raising him to be a boy who fears a woman with a book? A king should be respected, Mr. Choi. Your son is currently only feared. And fear is a debt that always comes due." For a long, agonizing beat, Gun-woo searched her face for a flicker of cowardice. He found only the unwavering fire of a woman who cared more about the boy's soul than her own safety. A ghost of a smile, sharp and dangerous, touched his lips. "Class starts in 5 minutes, Joon-woo," Gun-woo commanded, never taking his eyes off Lindiwe. "Go. Now." Joon-woo's smirk vanished. "But father." "Now." As the boys scurried away, Gun-woo leaned closer to Lindiwe's ear. "You are either the bravest woman in Seoul, or the most foolish. I haven't decided which. I will be watching." He turned on his heel, the black convoy vanishing as quickly as it had arrived, leaving Lindiwe alone in the ringing silence of the hall. The aftermath of the morning's confrontation left the school in a state of suspended animation. Lindiwe taught her lessons through a thick fog of hushed whispers and side-eye glances from colleagues who looked at her as if she were a walking ghost. Joon-woo, notably, remained silent, not the silence of a reformed student, but the brooding quiet of a predator waiting for the trap to spring. At 3 p.m., the summons came. Lindiwe didn't go to the principal's office. She was escorted by two of Gun-woo's men to a private lounge at the back of the school library. The door clicked shut behind her. Gun-woo was seated in a velvet armchair, a glass of amber liquid on the table beside him. He wasn't looking at her, he was flipping through Joon-woo's grade reports with a look of profound dissatisfaction. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't an invitation. Lindiwe sat, her spine a straight line of iron. "If you're looking for a refund on his tuition, Mr. Choi, you're looking at the wrong person. If you're looking for an apology, you found the wrong woman." Gun-woo finally looked up. The overhead lights caught the sharp planes of his face, making him look more like a weapon than a man. His previous teachers gave him straight marks. They called him a natural leader and a delight. You gave him a failing grade in conduct and a D in mathematics. The others were paid for their silence. "I am paid to teach," Lindiwe said. "Your son has the intellect to run a country, but the discipline of a spoiled house cat. He doesn't know how to work because he's been told he already owns the finish line." Gun-woo leaned forward, his presence expanding to fill the room. "In my world, results are the only currency. My son will inherit an empire that requires a heart of stone and a mind of steel. Why should I care if he is disciplined in the way a schoolteacher prefers?" "Because an empire built on a hollow foundation collapses," Lindiwe shot back. "You've taught him how to intimidate, but not how to endure. If he can't handle a no from a teacher, how will he handle a betrayal from a lieutenant? You are shielding him from the very growth he needs to survive you." The room grew suffocatingly still. Gun-woo's eyes narrowed, a predatory glint flickering in the dark depths of his pupils. He stood slowly, walking a circle around her chair like a wolf evaluating its prey. "You speak to me as if you are the one with the power here," he mused, stopping directly behind her. He placed a hand on the back of her chair. She could feel the heat radiating from him. "Do you realize I could end your career with a single phone call? Or your life with a nod?" "Then do it," Lindiwe said, her voice a steady, rhythmic pulse. "But as long as I am his teacher, he will be a student. Not a prince. Not a boss. Just a boy who needs to learn." Gun-woo stepped around to face her. For the first time, the cold mask cracked, revealing a flicker of something raw, curiosity. "You are a dangerous woman, Miss Cohn," he whispered. "You make me doubt my own methods. That is a rare, albeit irritating, talent." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored card. "My son is a mess. Fix him. My estate, Saturday morning. Don't be late." The Choi estate was not a home, it was a fortress of glass and grief. Perched on the jagged cliffs of Pyeongchang-dong, the mansion overlooked Seoul with the cold indifference of an observer. When the iron gates groaned open for Lindiwe on Saturday morning, she felt the shift in pressure. Here, the air tasted of pine and expensive security. A maid, eyes cast strictly toward the floor, led Lindiwe through a soaring marble atrium. Despite the opulence, the original Picassos and the floors buffed to a mirror shine, the house felt hollow. There were no photographs on the walls, no stray toys, no signs of the chaotic warmth that usually follows a child. "He is in the East Gallery," the maid whispered before vanishing into the shadows. Lindiwe found Joon-woo sitting at a mahogany table that could easily seat 20. He looked tiny against the vastness of the room, surrounded by a mountain of high-tech gadgets and discarded sweets. When he saw her, his face didn't twist into the usual snarl. Instead, he looked bored. A deep, soul-crushing boredom that no 7-year-old should possess. "You actually came," he said, flicking a gold-plated stylus onto the table. "I told my dad you'd be too scared." "I don't scare easily, Joon-woo. I grew up in a place where the lions are real, not just symbols on a family crest." Lindiwe set her leather bag down, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sterile room. She walked to the massive floor-to-ceiling window. Below, she could see a training yard where men in tactical gear moved in silent, lethal patterns. "Is that what you want?" she asked, gesturing to the guards below. "To be a man people only look at through a scope. Joon-woo walked over, standing a cautious distance from her. It's what I am. My dad says the world is a cage, and you're either the lock or the key. Your father is a man of many walls, Lindiwe observed softly. She turned to the boy, noting the dark circles under his eyes. But even the strongest lock gets rusty if it's never used. Tell me, Joon-woo, when was the last time you went to the park? Without the suits. Without the cars? The boy blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. I don't go to parks. They aren't secure. In that moment, the untouchable boy vanished. In his place stood a prisoner in a golden cage. Lindiwe realized then that his arrogance wasn't born of malice, but of isolation. He was acting out because negative attention was the only currency he had to buy a moment of his father's time. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the end of the gallery swung open. Choi Gun-woo entered, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and old scars. He stopped, framed by the sunlight, watching the educator and the heir. Is he behaving? Gun-woo asked, his gaze lingering on Lindiwe longer than necessary. He's being a child, Mr. Choi, Lindiwe replied, her voice softening for the first time. It's a shame no one noticed he was one until today. Gun-woo's expression tightened. The silence between them stretched, charged with an unspoken tension that felt less like a threat and more like a bridge. He looked at his son, then back at the woman who dared to pity a king. Begin the lesson, Gun-woo said, his voice strangely quiet. I want to see what you can build in a house designed for breaking. The mahogany table felt like a desert between them. For 2 hours, Lindiwe pushed, and Joon-woo resisted. It was a rhythmic dance of stubbornness. She would present a problem, and he would offer a smirk. I don't need to know fractions, Joon-woo stated, leaning back in his chair with a practiced air of indifference. I have people to count my money for me. Math isn't about money, Joon-woo, Lindiwe said, her voice calm and rhythmic. It's about logic. It's about seeing the patterns in the world before they see you. If you can't solve for X, you'll never see the person planning to take Y. The boy paused, the stylus hovering over his tablet. It was the first time she'd framed academics in the language of his father's world. But the walls didn't crumble that easily. By the third hour, the exhaustion of maintaining his untouchable persona began to show. His shoulders slumped, and his handwriting, usually sharp, became a jagged scrawl. I'm done, he snapped, throwing the stylus. It skidded across the table and clattered onto the marble floor. This is stupid. You're stupid. I want you to leave. Lindiwe didn't move. She didn't scold him. She simply picked up the stylus and set it back in front of him. It's okay to be frustrated. It's even okay to be tired. But you don't get to be disrespectful. You can't tell me what to do. Joon-woo's voice cracked, the high-pitched sound echoing off the cold stone walls. Suddenly, his eyes welled with tears, not of sadness, but of pure, unadulterated rage. Everyone does what I say. Why won't you just let me be? Because if I let you be, you'll stay exactly like this, Lindiwe said softly, leaning in. Lonely. Angry. Afraid that if you aren't the loudest person in the room, you don't exist at all. The dam broke. Joon-woo didn't just cry, he sobbed. It was a raw, ugly sound that tore through the artificial perfection of the East Gallery. He slumped forward, his forehead resting on the cool wood of the table. Lindiwe hesitated, then reached out, placing a steady hand on his small, shaking shoulder. For a second, he stiffened, then he leaned into the touch, the first genuine, unscripted contact he had felt in years. I can't do it, he whispered into his sleeves. He wants me to be like him. But I'm not. I'm not a dragon. You don't have to be a dragon to be powerful, Joon-woo, she murmured. From the shadows of the doorway, Choi Gun-woo watched. He had come to intervene, to stop the noise, but he stood paralyzed. He saw his son, the boy he was grooming for war, sobbing like the child he actually was. And he saw the woman who had managed to do what no bodyguard or tutor ever could. She had found the boy beneath the armor. Gun-woo retreated into the hallway, his heart thumping with a rhythm he didn't recognize. He realized then that Lindiwe wasn't just teaching his son math, she was teaching him how to survive the silence of his own home. And for the first time in his life, the most feared man in Seoul felt completely out of his depth. The atmosphere in the Choi dining hall was different that evening. The usual clinical silence had been replaced by the soft hum of Lindiwe's voice as she finished a story about the South African grasslands. Joon-woo sat beside her, his eyes bright, the tear-streaked face of the afternoon replaced by a rare, genuine curiosity. When Gun-woo entered, he had discarded his tie. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, taking his place at the head of the table. Usually, he ate in a silence so profound it felt like an interrogation. Tonight, he watched. He finished his equations, Mr. Choi, Lindiwe said, breaking the tension as the staff began serving a meticulously plated dinner. And he did so without a single person counting his money for him. Joon-woo looked at his father, his chest swelling with a tentative pride. I used the patterns, father. Like the ones you use in the meetings. Gun-woo's gaze shifted from his son to Lindiwe. The candlelight flickered in the dark pools of his eyes, softening the harsh angles of his jaw. Patterns, he repeated, his voice low. You've been teaching him my business, Miss Cohn? I've been teaching him that intelligence is a weapon only when it's sharpened by discipline, she replied, meeting his gaze over the rim of her water glass. A lesson some adults could stand to revisit. A sharp, sudden bark of laughter escaped Gun-woo's lips. The sound was so foreign to the house that even the servers paused. You truly have no filter when it comes to me, do you? Filter is for people who are afraid of the truth. I assumed a man of your stature preferred his whiskey and his facts neat. The air between them charged instantly. It wasn't the spark of an argument, but the heavy, electric pull of two gravity wells colliding. Gun-woo reached for his wine, his fingers brushing near Lindiwe's hand. The contact was brief, a mere ghost of a touch, but it sent a jolt through the room that made Joon-woo look between them with wide eyes. You are an enigma, Gun-woo said, his voice dropping to a private register. You walk into a house of wolves and treat the alpha like a schoolboy. Tell me, Lindiwe, what is it you actually want? It clearly isn't the money. I want the boy to have a choice, she said, her voice unshakable. I want him to grow up and decide who he is, rather than being told who he must be by a man who is too busy being a boss to be a father. Gun-woo didn't recoil. He leaned closer, his scent, sandalwood and iron, enveloping her. For a moment, the Mafia king disappeared, and she saw the man beneath, a man burdened by the weight of a crown he never asked for, looking at the only person who didn't look away. Eat your dinner, Joon-woo, Gun-woo said, never breaking eye contact with Lindiwe. It seems we both have a lot more to learn from Miss Cohn. The following Tuesday, the air in Seoul felt heavy, pregnant with the metallic scent of an approaching storm. At the Choi estate, the shift was palpable. The usual guards were replaced by men in tactical vests, and the frequency of Gun-woo's encrypted phone calls tripled. Lindiwe sat with Joon-woo in the library, the boy diligently working through a series of complex logic puzzles. He had traded his arrogance for a quiet, intense focus that mirrored his father's. Miss Cohn, Joon-woo whispered, not looking up from his paper. Why are there so many cars outside today? Lindiwe looked toward the window. The black sedans were no longer idling, they were positioned like shields. Your father is a very busy man, Joon-woo. He's just making sure his house is secure. They're the old lions, Joon-woo said, his voice trembling slightly. That's what the housekeepers call them. The men who worked for my grandfather. They don't like my father. They think he's gone soft because of us. Lindiwe felt a cold finger of dread trace her spine. She had known the world of Choi Gun-woo was built on blood, but she had allowed the quiet dinners and the boys' progress to lull her into a false sense of safety. The library doors burst open. Gun-woo entered, but he wasn't the refined man from dinner. He was a storm. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his hair disarrayed, and a smear of something dark and unmistakable stained his cuff. Out, he barked at Joon-woo. Go to the safe room with the captain. Now. Joon-woo scrambled to his feet, his newfound discipline holding even in fear. He looked at Lindiwe, a silent plea in his eyes, before disappearing through a hidden panel in the shelving. Lindiwe stood her ground as Gun-woo approached. What is happening? The price of progress, Gun-woo hissed, his eyes darting to the windows. The traditionalists in the syndicate see Joon-woo's softening as a weakness in the bloodline. They think my focus on his education is a distraction from the business. They've moved against the southern docks. He grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with a desperate, crushing urgency. You need to leave. Now. My men will take you to a safe house in Incheon. I am not leaving that boy in a panic room while men hunt his father, Lindiwe said, her voice rising with a fierce, maternal heat. This isn't a classroom, Lindiwe. This is a war. Gun-woo roared, slamming his hand against the mahogany table. If they find you here, they will use you to break me. They know you're the only one who can reach him. They know you're the only one who dares to look me in the eye. He stepped closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. The anger in his eyes flickered, replaced by a raw, terrifying vulnerability. I can survive a bullet. I cannot survive losing the woman who gave my son back his soul. Please. For the first time, Lindiwe saw the cracks in the dragon's armor. He wasn't just protecting a teacher, he was protecting the only light in his dark, violent world. Before she could answer, the distant, muffled sound of a flashbang echoed from the gates. The shadow of the past had finally arrived at the door. The estate erupted into a symphony of controlled chaos. The muffled thud-thud-thud of heavy footsteps on the roof and the sharp, rhythmic pops of suppressed gunfire signaled that the old lions had breached the perimeter. Gun-woo reached for a weapon concealed beneath the table, but his eyes never left Lindiwe's. Go. Now, he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. I'm going to him, Lindiwe said, referring to the hidden panel where Joon-woo had disappeared. She didn't wait for Gun-woo's permission. She knew that in a world of shifting alliances and blood debts, a child's terror was the only absolute. She slipped through the bookshelf into the narrow, dimly lit corridor that led to the safe room. The air here was cold and smelled of ozone. When she reached the heavy steel door, she found Joon-woo huddled in the corner, his knees pressed to his chest. The captain, a scarred veteran of the Choi Wars, stood guard with a rifle, but his eyes were glued to the security monitors. He's fighting them alone, Joon-woo whispered, his voice small and brittle. He was watching a screen that showed his father in the library, moving with the lethal fluidity of a man who had been born in the dark. Lindiwe sat beside the boy on the cold floor. He's not alone, Joon-woo. He's fighting for you. But they say he's weak because of me, the boy choked out, a single tear tracking through the dust on his cheek. They say a boss shouldn't care about school or kindness. Lindiwe took his hand, her grip firm and grounding. Loyalty isn't just about following orders, Joon-woo. It's about what you're willing to protect when everything is burning. Your father isn't weak. He's finally found something worth more than power. That makes him more dangerous than any of those men outside. On the monitor, a group of attackers entered the library. One of them, an older man with silver hair, one of the old lions, stepped forward to face Gun-woo. Even through the grainy footage, the tension was visceral. Suddenly, the screen flickered. The lights in the safe room surged and then died, plunging them into a thick, suffocating blackness. Joon-woo gasped, his fingers digging into Lindiwe's arm. Stay quiet, the captain hissed, his weapon clicking as he disengaged the safety. In the dark, Lindiwe pulled Joon-woo closer. She could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her side. Remember the logic puzzles, Joon-woo, she whispered into his ear, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. Don't focus on the noise. Focus on the pattern. We are the X in the equation. We stay hidden so he can solve for the rest. I'm brave, Joon-woo whispered back, more to himself than to her. I'm a Choi. I'm brave. You are more than a Choi, Lindiwe corrected, her eyes fixed on the door as the sound of boots echoed in the hallway outside. "You are a boy who knows the value of a promise. And I promised I wouldn't leave you." The door handle rattled. The captain raised his rifle. In the silence of the vault, the lesson on loyalty had ended. The test had begun. The rattling handle was followed by a heavy, metallic thud. Someone was trying to breach the safe room with a kinetic ram. Each blow vibrated through the floorboards, a rhythmic heartbeat of impending violence. "Joon-woo, look at me," Lindiwe commanded, her voice cutting through the boy's rising panic. She ignored the captain, who was positioned behind a tactical crate, his finger hovering over the trigger. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn book, a collection of African folk tales she always carried. "Read," she said, thrusting the book into his trembling hands. I can't," he stammered. "The lights. Use the emergency glow. Focus on the words. The world outside this door does not exist. Only the story exists." It was an impossible task, a desperate distraction. But Joon-woo, conditioned by weeks of her firm discipline, opened the book. His voice was a mere thread of sound, competing with the splintering of the outer library doors. Once there was a lion who forgot how to roar. Outside, the mansion screamed. The sound of shattered glass and the staccato rhythm of gunfire felt uncomfortably close. Lindiwe stood and moved toward the monitor, which flickered back to life with a dying gasp of battery power. She saw Gun-woo. He was a shadow among shadows, pinned behind the mahogany desk she had sat at only hours before. He was bleeding from a graze on his temple, his white shirt ruined, but his eyes were terrifying. He wasn't fighting like a mobster protecting turf, he was fighting like a man protecting a sanctuary. He was the barrier between the wolves and the only two people who saw him as human. The heavy door to the safe room groaned. A seam of light appeared as the steel began to buckle. "Captain," Lindiwe whispered, her eyes never leaving the screen. "If they get through, I need you to give me 10 seconds before you fire. Just 10. The guard looked at her as if she were insane. "Ma'am? They think he is weak because of us," she said, her voice turning to ice. "I am going to show them they are wrong." The door burst open with a deafening crack. 2 men in black tactical gear surged in, their weapons raised. But they stopped. Lindiwe was standing in the center of the room, not cowering, but shielding Joon-woo with her own body. The boy was still reading, his voice cracking but persistent, and the lion realized his roar was not for fear, but for family. The lead assassin hesitated. He had expected a screaming child and a begging woman. Instead, he found a queen and a prince who refused to acknowledge his presence. That split second of confusion was all the opening needed. A shadow rose behind the assassins. Gun-woo had followed them in, moving through the carnage he had left behind in the hall. With a roar that shook the very foundation of the estate, he descended upon them. It wasn't a fight, it was an exorcism. When the last attacker fell, the room plunged into a horrific, ringing silence. Gun-woo stood in the doorway, gasping for air, covered in the red evidence of his struggle. He looked at Lindiwe, then at his son, who finally closed the book. "The lion saved them, Ms. Kohn," Joon-woo whispered into the quiet. Gun-woo dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, not out of injury, but out of a sudden, overwhelming release of soul-deep terror. Lindiwe crossed the room and placed a hand on his bloodied shoulder. For the first time, the boss didn't pull away. He leaned his forehead against her waist and finally let out the breath he had been holding for a lifetime. The weeks following the siege were marked by a silence that was no longer hollow, but heavy with the weight of reconstruction. The old lions had been purged, not just from the estate, but from the very fabric of Seoul's underworld. Gun-woo had dismantled the jagged edges of his empire, trading the volatility of fear for the surgical precision of respect. On the day of the Seoul Royal Preparatory Annual Awards, the school's grand auditorium was a sea of silk and ego. The air usually hummed with the competitive energy of parents who viewed their children as assets. Lindiwe sat in the faculty row, her hands folded in her lap. She looked different, the rigid blazer was gone, replaced by a dress of vibrant African print that defied the muted tones of the room. Beside her, an empty seat remained guarded by a man in a discreet suit. And finally, the principal announced, his voice no longer trembling, the award for exceptional character and transformation. He paused, looking toward the back of the hall. The heavy oak doors swung open. Choi Gun-woo entered. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored black suit, but the lethal aura that had once preceded him had shifted into something grounded and immovable. He didn't head for the VIP section. He walked straight to the front and took the seat next to Lindiwe. "You're late," she whispered, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "I had to ensure the world was quiet enough for him to speak," Gun-woo replied, his hand briefly covering hers. The touch was no longer a question, it was an anchor. "Joon-woo Choi," the principal called. The boy walked onto the stage. He didn't swagger, and he didn't look for the exit. He stood tall, his gaze finding Lindiwe first, then his father. He accepted the trophy with a bow that carried more grace than any of the princes who had preceded him. "I used to think being strong meant being scary," Joon-woo said into the microphone, his voice steady and clear. "But my teacher taught me that the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't have to raise their voice to be heard. And my father taught me that a kingdom is only worth having if there is someone worth sharing it with." The applause was polite, but the silence that followed was profound. The elite of Seoul looked at the Choi family and saw something they couldn't buy, a legacy forged in discipline and love. Later, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, the three of them stood on the school balcony. "What happens now?" Gun-woo asked, looking out over the city he had once ruled with an iron fist, and now served with a steady hand. "Now," Lindiwe said, looking from the man to the boy who had become her world, "the real lesson begins. We learn how to be a family in a world that finally knows we're here." Gun-woo reached out, pulling both of them into the circle of his arms. The untouchable boy was finally held, the fearful boss was finally at peace, and the teacher had finally found a home that no curriculum could ever describe. A new story had begun.